There is a list of names that changed the shape of a nation. Names carried across a stretch of grey water in the autumn of 1066, stitched into the fabric of English life so thoroughly that most people who carry them today have no idea where they truly began. For centuries, the story was simple. These were Norman names. Norse blood, Viking fire, French polish. A warrior aristocracy that swept in, took the land, and left its surnames behind like flags planted in conquered soil. That story held for almost 1,000 years. Then geneticists opened the archive that no chronicler could edit, no herald could embellish, and no lost record could erase: the human genome. And what they found inside the men who still carry these 13 names did not simply confirm the legend. It complicated it, layer by layer, until the tidy image of the Norman conqueror began to look like the smallest part of a much older, much stranger story. This is not a tale about one battle. It is about what a name can hide, and what blood can remember when history forgets. For most of English history, the version we were taught felt almost cinematic in its clarity. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Norse raiders and settlers pushed into the region of northern France that would become known as Normandy, literally, land of the Northmen. Within a few generations, these Scandinavian newcomers adopted French language, French customs, French Christianity, and became something new, the Normans. In 1066, under William, Duke of Normandy, they crossed the Channel, defeated the English king at Hastings, and reorganized the entire social order of England from the top down. With that reorganization came names: Baskerville, Persis, Mandeville, Montgomery, Neville, Gurnet, Ferrers, Warren, Tancarville, Tosnett, Grenville, Courtney, 13 surnames, among many others, that historians have long treated as reliable markers of Norman descent, family lines you could trace, in theory, all the way back to the ships. It was a clean narrative. Conquest at the top, continuity in the bloodline, and a surname as a kind of genetic passport stamped nearly 1,000 years ago. Aristocratic families kept meticulous records. Heraldry reinforced identity. The story seemed almost too well documented to question. And for a long time, nobody seriously tried. But historians working closely with these old Norman-descended families started noticing something that did not sit comfortably. In several supposedly Norman lineages, the customs, landholding patterns, and even some naming conventions showed signs of pre-conquest, distinctly non-Norse local influence: Frankish, Gallo-Roman, sometimes Breton. Some family traditions spoke of ancestors already established in Normandy before the Viking settlements even began, which contradicted the assumption that Norman elite bloodlines were fundamentally Scandinavian imports. It was a small crack, the kind of detail an archivist notices and sets aside, because surnames are supposed to be reliable. A name passed from father to son should, in theory, trace an unbroken paternal line. That is precisely why geneticists became interested. If surname and biology moved together for centuries, then the Y chromosome, passed almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, should preserve the story written into the family name. So they went looking. The tool that made this possible is deceptively simple in concept. The Y chromosome is inherited almost entirely intact down the paternal line, accumulating small mutations at a slow, measurable rate. By comparing these mutations across men who share a surname, researchers can estimate whether they share a common ancestor and roughly how long ago that ancestor lived. Pair that with broader autosomal DNA, the mixed genetic inheritance from all ancestral lines, not just the paternal one, and you get something close to a layered map of ancestry, not just a single thread. Researchers pulled Y chromosome samples from men bearing these 13 historically Norman surnames across England, France, and diaspora communities beyond. The expectation, based on thumbnail history, was straightforward: a Scandinavian-linked genetic signature, likely haplogroups associated with Norse expansion, showing up consistently across these paternal lines. If stories like this fascinate you, the quiet places where history and genetics collide and rewrite each other, it might be worth subscribing, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most surnames ever admit. What the data returned instead was not a single signature. It was several, and they did not agree with each other. Some of the 13 surname groups did show Y chromosome markers consistent with known Scandinavian lineages, the kind linked to broader Norse expansion across the North Atlantic world. That much lined up with expectation. But other lines carrying the exact same historically Norman surname showed almost no trace of that signature at all. Instead, their paternal markers matched more closely with populations already established in continental Gaul long before any Viking ships arrived. Old Celtic and Gallo-Roman substrate populations that had occupied the region for well over 1,000 years before the word Norman existed. That was not supposed to happen. A surname is meant to be a single line. Instead, researchers were looking at multiple, unrelated paternal origins wearing the same name. The story did not collapse. It widened. There is a phenomenon geneticists sometimes call non-paternity events, instances across centuries where a son did not, biologically, descend from the man whose surname he carried, whether through adoption, remarriage, illegitimacy, or simple record-keeping ambiguity in an age before birth certificates. That explains some of the divergence. But it does not explain all of it. In several of the 13 lineages, the divide was too old, too structured, and too consistent with regional geography to be dismissed as scattered accidents. It looked, instead, like something more deliberate, multiple founding fathers, in different places, independently adopting or being granted the same name. Which meant the question was no longer simply, were the Normans Viking or French? The deeper question became, were these 13 names ever a single bloodline at all, or were they administrative and territorial labels, absorbed by different founding families who were never genetically related to one another in the first place? At this point, 3 explanations began to compete for the evidence. The first is admixture on a scale historians underestimated, the idea that Norse settlers in Normandy intermarried so extensively and so quickly with existing Gallo-Frankish populations that, within 2 or 3 generations, the paternal line itself became a patchwork, with some branches retaining Norse Y chromosome markers and others reverting almost entirely to local ancestry, even while the family identity, land, and surname stayed nominally Norman. The second is what some researchers describe cautiously as name convergence, a scenario in which a toponymic surname, tied to a specific piece of land or castle rather than a specific bloodline, could be adopted independently by unrelated families who simply held that territory at different points, or who took the name of a lord they served rather than a father they descended from. In a feudal world where land, loyalty, and lineage were often more tightly bound than biology, this is not far-fetched. It may, in fact, be closer to how many medieval names actually worked. The third is older and stranger still, the possibility of a ghost population, an ancestral genetic signal present in parts of pre-Viking Normandy that does not map cleanly onto either classical Scandinavian or classical Frankish categories, hinting at earlier, less documented movements of people through the region, Roman-era military settlement, earlier Germanic migrations predating the Vikings by centuries, or Celtic populations whose deep ancestry has simply never been fully sequenced. Researchers are careful here. The evidence does not prove a lost population. It complicates the assumption that there were only 2 ancestral ingredients to begin with. No single explanation has been confirmed as dominant. What multiple studies increasingly suggest is that all 3 forces were likely operating simultaneously, at different times, in different family lines, folded into names that were never meant to encode pure ancestry in the first place. The turning point came with a broader comparative study, one that moved beyond isolated surname sampling and instead cross-referenced Y chromosome data with autosomal ancestry panels drawn from ancient DNA recovered across northern France, southern England, and Scandinavia. This was significant because ancient DNA does something modern surname studies cannot. It does not rely on a name at all. It reads the bone directly. When researchers compared medieval-era skeletal remains from Norman-associated burial sites to the modern descendants of these 13 surnames, the ancient samples themselves showed a wide spread of ancestry, some individuals with strong Scandinavian genetic affinity, buried in the same churchyards, same centuries, same social class as others whose ancestry was almost entirely local Gallo-Frankish, with little or no detectable Norse component at all. In other words, the Norman elite, even at the moment of the conquest itself, was already a genetically mixed population. Not a bloodline that later diluted. A blend from the very beginning. That was the twist the surname records could never have revealed on their own. Not a single warrior people from the north, arriving pure and conquering forward. Something closer to a coalition, Scandinavian settlers, local Frankish nobility, Breton families, and quite possibly older. Gallo-Roman lines, all merging under a shared political identity long before they ever called themselves Norman, and long before that identity crossed the channel wearing 13 surnames that historians would later treat as biological certainties. The surprise was not that mixing occurred. Migration-era Europe was never as genetically sealed as later nationalism liked to imagine. The surprise was how early, how thorough, and how invisible that mixing had been, hidden for centuries beneath a name that implied a single, clean paternal origin. This matters beyond 13 aristocratic surnames and one medieval conquest. It touches something larger about how humans have always told stories about themselves. We are a species that prefers clean lines. A founder, a homeland, a single ancestor standing at the root of a family tree, unbroken, unmixed, easy to draw on paper. But the genome does not draw family trees. It draws networks, overlapping, tangled, built from thousands of unrecorded unions across centuries that no chronicler thought worth writing down, because at the time, they were simply life. Normandy in the 10th and 11th centuries was not a monument. It was a frontier, a place where Norse longships beached on river mouths that Roman roads had crossed centuries before, where Frankish counts negotiated with Viking chieftains not only through treaties but through marriages, where a child born in the year 950 might carry a Scandinavian father's sword arm and a Frankish mother's tongue, and grow up belonging fully to neither old world and completely to the new one being built between them. Stand today on the Norman coast, where the wind moves the same gray water the ships once crossed, and it is difficult not to feel the strangeness of it. How much of human history is written not by people staying pure, but by peoples meeting, colliding, and quietly becoming something that had never existed before. That is the deeper inheritance carried by these 13 surnames, not proof of a single ancestor from the north, but evidence of confluence. A family name, it turns out, was never a promise of unbroken blood. It was a container, and inside that container, history kept pouring in new water for 1,000 years. The old story said the Normans conquered England and left their bloodlines stamped across its aristocracy. The genome tells something more honest and, in its way, more remarkable, that the conquerors themselves were already a merger of peoples before they ever crossed the channel, and that the names we thought marked a beginning were, in truth, marking a meeting point. The map is not wrong so much as it was always incomplete, a sketch drawn from surnames and chronicles, waiting for the genome to fill in the parts no medieval scribe thought to record. If you carry one of these names, or simply find yourself drawn to the places where history quietly rewrites itself, let me know in the comments which population or surname story deserves this kind of investigation next. The past, it turns out, is rarely as settled as the names we inherited from it.